Picture this. It's November 20, 1943. You're a United States Marine. You've been packed into a steel boat with 35 other men. It smells like diesel, sweat, and something else, something you don't want to identify. The boat's rocking hard. Half the guys around you have already vomited. One guy is praying quietly. Another is completely silent, which somehow is worse. You're heading toward a small island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's barely 3 kilometers long. You could drive across it in 4 minutes. Your commanding officers have told you this operation will be over in a matter of hours. Easy, textbook, you'll be home for Christmas. They are catastrophically wrong. In the next 76 hours, 1,000 American Marines and sailors will die. Another 2,000 will be wounded. And when the smoke finally clears, senior U.S. military commanders will stare at what happened and experience something rare for men of their rank: genuine, stomach-dropping shock. Not because they lost the battle. They won the battle. But the cost, the staggering, almost incomprehensible cost of winning, forced one of the most powerful military organizations in human history to stop, sit down, and completely rebuild how it approached warfare from the water. What went wrong? What did they miss? And how did one tiny atoll, a coral ring barely wider than a city block at some points, end up rewriting the doctrine of every major navy on Earth? Stay with me, because this story has layers that most history books don't go near. Let's talk about where Tarawa actually is, because its location is the entire reason this catastrophe happened. The Gilbert Islands sit roughly in the center of the Pacific, almost exactly on the equator. In 1943, the United States needed them, not because the islands had oil or minerals or any inherent strategic value, but because of geometry. The American war plan, the push westward toward Japan, required air bases. To build air bases, you needed land. And in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, land is extremely rare. The Gilbert Islands were stepping stones. Capture them, build airstrips, then use those airstrips to capture the next set of islands, and so on, leapfrogging across the ocean until you were close enough to hit Japan itself. Baitio, the main island of the Tarawa Atoll, was the crown jewel. It had a Japanese-built airstrip that the Americans desperately wanted. The island was 3.2 kilometers long and at no point wider than 800 meters. In terms of total land area, it was smaller than New York's Central Park. Here's the thing about Baitio that will haunt you. The Japanese knew they couldn't hold the entire Pacific. They had a different plan. Rather than spreading their defenses thin, they chose specific locations and fortified them to an almost insane degree. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki, the commander of Baitio's garrison, reportedly said this: "1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years." That wasn't bravado. That was a man who had looked at his fortifications and done the math. His garrison had 4,500 troops, 2,600 of them elite naval infantry. They had 14 coastal defense guns, including 8-inch guns taken from Singapore after its fall. They had 40 artillery pieces. They had hundreds of machine gun positions. They had tank traps and seawalls and obstacles designed to stop landing craft at the waterline. And the whole island was connected by an intricate system of tunnels and bunkers built from reinforced concrete and coconut logs so dense that some of them could withstand a direct hit from a naval shell. Now here's the detail that stops people cold when they first encounter it. The Americans knew most of this going in. They had aerial photographs. They had intelligence reports. They knew Baitio was the most heavily fortified island in the Pacific at that moment, This wasn't a surprise. So why did they go anyway? Because the alternative, bypassing the Gilberts and leaving Japanese air power intact at your flank, was considered more dangerous. The battle was deemed necessary. What the planners believed, genuinely, confidently believed, was that the pre-landing naval and air bombardment would be so ferocious, so overwhelming, that most of those defenses would be rubble before the first Marine put a boot on the beach. They ran the numbers. They liked the numbers. The numbers were about to lie to them.
Here is where the story takes a turn that should be studied in every planning seminar, military or otherwise. The assault on Bateo required landing craft to cross a reef. Bateo, like most Pacific islands of its type, is surrounded by a coral reef that extends several hundred meters out from the beach. At high tide, there is enough water over the reef for boats to float across. At low tide, the reef becomes a flat, exposed shelf, a killing field, where any vehicle attempting to cross would simply run aground. The operation planners knew about the reef. It was on their charts. What they disagreed about was the tides. A New Zealand officer named Major Frank Holland, who had lived and worked in the area before the war, warned the planners repeatedly. The tides around Bateo were unusual. Unlike the predictable tidal patterns found most places, Tarawa sat in a zone where the water level could remain at a neap state for days at a stretch. Holland said, "There is a real chance that on the day of the landing, the tide will not rise enough to allow conventional landing craft over the reef." The senior planners listened to him, and then, essentially, chose to hope he was wrong. One admiral said the tide would be adequate. Another said conditions would be favorable. These were not predictions based on data. These were expressions of optimism dressed up as operational assessments. When November 20th came, the tide was, at best, 3 feet over the reef. Most landing craft needed 4 to 5 feet to clear the coral without grounding. The result was predictable in hindsight and catastrophic in real time. The Higgins boats, the standard American landing craft, started hitting the reef hundreds of meters from shore. Ramps dropped. Marines climbed out into water that was, in some places, chest deep, and between them and the beach stretched hundreds of meters of open water with no cover, under withering fire from an intact defense network that the pre-bombardment had not, despite the planners' confidence, destroyed. Men who made it to shore described walking on bodies on the reef, not past them, over them. The water was so thick with casualties that it was difficult to move without stepping on the dead. This is the part of the story that tends to go quiet in popular retellings. The pre-bombardment had failed for a second reason, too. The naval guns and aircraft had absolutely hammered Bateo. By the time the landing craft were approaching, the island had been hit by more explosive tonnage in a shorter time than almost anywhere in the Pacific War to that point. Coconut palms were shredded, buildings were flattened, the beach itself looked like the surface of the moon. But the Japanese bunkers, the ones built from reinforced concrete and layered coconut logs, they were fine, or fine enough. Enough men inside them survived to man their weapons, because the design of those bunkers, low profile, multiple overlapping walls, deep embrasures, meant that unless a shell landed inside the bunker through its gun port, the structure held. And the odds of that kind of direct hit from a moving ship at sea were, mathematically, very low. The Marines landed into a defense that had been scratched and dented, and then they were shot at by thousands of men who were angry and unhurt and ready.
Here's the thing about courage that war reveals in the most brutal possible way. It doesn't always work. Courage is not a tactical asset. You can be the bravest person who ever lived and still die on a reef 100 meters from a beach that doesn't care about your courage. And on November 20th, 1943, that reef killed people who had every quality a soldier is supposed to have. What saved the battle, what turned near-total catastrophe into eventual victory, was a combination of factors so improbable that even historians still argue about how much was skill and how much was something else entirely. Let's talk about the LVTs. Landing Vehicle Tracked, Amtrak, was a relatively new piece of equipment. It was essentially an armored amphibious vehicle that moved on tracks rather than propellers, which meant it could crawl over the reef rather than float over it. The Marines had 75 LVTs for the Tarawa assault. The problem was, 75 was not nearly enough. There were 18,000 Marines preparing for the assault, and most of them would have to use Higgins boats. The men who went in on LVTs had a fighting chance of reaching the beach. The men in the Higgins boats were dropped on the reef. Colonel David Shoup landed on that beach under conditions that should have resulted in his death within minutes. He was wounded early in the fighting, not once but multiple times. He kept moving, he kept coordinating. He was the kind of commander who refuses to let the situation become the final word. He was later awarded the Medal of Honor. Later still, decades after the war, he became the Commandant of the Marine Corps and then a vocal critic of military adventurism, a man shaped irrevocably by what he'd seen on that beach. But here's what Shoup and the other survivors couldn't do on day one: break through. The Marines who made it ashore were pinned in narrow pockets, clustered behind a coconut log seawall that turned out to be the only thing keeping them alive. They couldn't advance, they couldn't retreat. Retreating meant going back into the water, back onto the reef, back into the fire. They were stuck. Night fell on a beach where Americans controlled small strips of sand measured in meters, and the Japanese controlled everything else. Back on the command ships, the generals and admirals received fragmentary reports. The situation was unclear. Was the beachhead viable? Should they send the reserves in, and if so, where? The second wave of Marines waited in their boats in the dark, waiting for orders that were slow to come, because nobody truly knew what was happening on shore. This is the second catastrophic failure that Tarawa exposed: communication. Radio equipment was waterlogged, smashed, or simply not designed for the chaos of a contested beach landing. Commanders on shore couldn't talk reliably to commanders at sea. Commanders at sea were making decisions based on information that was hours out of date. In some cases, they were ordering units to land on beaches that had been overrun by Japanese counterattacks after the last report came in. Men died landing on the wrong beach at the wrong time because nobody had a clear picture. By the end of day one, the Marines had established a beachhead so small and so precarious that military analysts studying it afterward described it as technically not survivable. The men on the beach, somehow, survived it anyway.
This is the part of the story that doesn't get told enough, because most people, when they hear about Tarawa, hear about the disaster of the landing, the bodies on the reef, the grounded boats, the unbroken defenses. And that's all true, but the battle didn't end on day one. And what happened on day two tells you something important about how military organizations, when they're functioning at their best, adapt in real time. Overnight, something shifted. The officers on the beach, the ones who had survived day one, had spent the night doing what good military leaders do in catastrophic situations. They observed, they communicated what they could, and they made plans. They had identified something. The Japanese defense, for all its ferocity and preparation, had a structural weakness. Not a physical weakness in the bunkers, a doctrinal weakness.
Japanese defensive doctrine at the time called for the destruction of an amphibious force in the water, or failing that, at the waterline. The bunker system was oriented primarily toward the sea. Once an enemy force was inside the defense perimeter, once they were on the island and moving inland, the Japanese defenses became harder to coordinate because many of the firing positions simply weren't designed to engage threats from behind. The Marines on the beach had already, without knowing it, gotten past the part of the defense that was designed to stop them. Day 2 saw the surviving Marines do something remarkable. With limited ammunition, limited reinforcements, and no sleep, they began attacking forward rather than defending their position. They started destroying bunkers not by shooting at them from the front, but by flanking them, getting to the sides or rear where the concrete was thinner and the Japanese inside couldn't easily return fire. This required individual initiative at a level that's genuinely uncommon in military history. There was no coordinated order from a central command. There couldn't be. Communications were still largely broken. What happened instead was a series of small unit actions, squad by squad, where individual Marine NCOs and junior officers looked at a problem and improvised a solution. Sergeant William Bordelon is one name that stands out. He ran a bulldozer under direct fire to clear obstacles. He was killed. He also received the Medal of Honor posthumously, and his actions, like those of dozens of other Marines that day, represent the kind of adaptive, decentralized combat effectiveness that militaries spend decades trying to build, and often only discover they've built it in moments of absolute extremity. By the afternoon of Day 2, the Marines had expanded their beachhead dramatically. Japanese counterattacks came at night and were repelled. Slowly, painfully, the math was shifting. But there was still a third of the island to take, and the hardest bunkers were yet to come.
Day 3. By this point, the Marines had a working system. Not elegant, not the system the planners had designed, but a real, functional approach to destroying fortified positions that had been learned in blood over the previous 48 hours. Flamethrower teams, demolition charges, coordinated flanking movements, tank support that had finally gotten ashore in usable numbers, and a critical tactical insight that sounds almost obvious in retrospect. Instead of trying to suppress a bunker with small arms fire, which accomplished almost nothing against reinforced concrete, you got close enough to throw a grenade or satchel charge into the firing aperture. Getting that close required covering fire, courage, and often luck. The last major Japanese strongpoint on Baishio fell in the afternoon of November 23rd. 76 hours after the first wave of Marines hit the reef. Admiral Shibazaki was already dead, killed by a naval shell on the first day, which had disrupted Japanese command and control and likely contributed to the somewhat fragmented nature of their counterattacks. Of his 4,500-man garrison, approximately 4,690 were dead or dying. Just 17 Japanese combatants surrendered. The rest fought until they were killed, some of them in suicidal charges across open ground that the Marines cut down with rifle and machine gun fire. The Marines found the bunkers afterward. They walked through them with the dazed expression of people trying to understand what they'd been fighting against. The concrete walls were in places 3 feet thick. The coconut log overhead cover was in layers. Some bunkers had taken multiple direct hits from naval shells and were scratched and scorched, but structurally intact. One Marine, years later, described standing in a bunker and realizing for the first time that the men inside it had been essentially invulnerable to everything the Americans had thrown at them from the sea. "We couldn't have bombed them out," he said. "We had to go in after them." That sentence, "we had to go in after them," is the operational lesson of Tarawa in 11 words.
and it cost 1,009 Americans their lives to learn it.
Now we get to the part that actually matters for the larger arc of history. Because Tarawa didn't just kill people, it produced knowledge. And that knowledge, paid for at a price that still causes historians to fall quiet mid-sentence when they discuss it, fundamentally changed how the United States, and eventually the entire Western military alliance, approached amphibious warfare. The after-action reports were brutal in their honesty. The Navy and Marine Corps did not cover up what happened at Tarawa. They did not minimize the failures or attribute them to bad luck. They sat down with the evidence and asked hard questions. Here is what they found and what they changed. The tide problem. Immediately, the Navy commissioned systematic hydrographic surveys of every potential landing zone in the Pacific. Never again would an assault rely on an officer's optimistic estimate. Dedicated survey teams would go in ahead of the assault force, often at extraordinary personal risk, to take actual measurements and predict actual water depths on actual dates. The science of pre-assault hydrographic reconnaissance was essentially created at Tarawa. The bombardment problem. Pre-landing bombardment was redesigned from the ground up. The lesson was not bomb more, it was bomb differently. Aircraft and naval guns were retargeted specifically for bunker busting rather than area suppression. New munitions were developed. And critically, the duration of bombardment before the landing was dramatically extended. At Tarawa, the pre-bombardment lasted roughly 3 hours. By 1944, at Peleliu and Iwo Jima, it lasted days. At Okinawa, it lasted weeks. The bombs got bigger, the targeting got more precise, and the focus shifted from destroying buildings to destroying fighting positions. The amphibious vehicle problem. The LVT, the Amtrak, was immediately recognized as essential, not supplementary. Production was massively scaled up. By the time of the Mariana Islands campaign in June 1944, the Marines had hundreds of LVTs where they had dozens at Tarawa. By Iwo Jima in 1945, the armored LVT had been further developed into a vehicle that could suppress targets as it crossed the reef, not just carry men. The communication problem. This one took longer to solve because the technology of the era placed genuine limits on what was achievable. But immediately after Tarawa, dedicated shore fire control parties, small teams whose entire job was to coordinate naval gunfire with ground forces in real time, were formalized and trained. Radio procedures were standardized. Backup communication methods were established. The principle that a commander on a ship 6 miles offshore should not be making landing decisions based on information that was 2 hours old became a doctrinal requirement rather than a suggestion. The intelligence problem. Aerial photography, which had been used somewhat haphazardly before Tarawa, became a systematic tool. Photo interpreters, specialists trained to read aerial reconnaissance images and identify fortifications, gun positions, obstacles, and troop concentrations, became essential members of every assault planning team. The idea of landing without a detailed understanding of what you were landing onto became, after Tarawa, nearly unthinkable. Each of these changes was tested in subsequent operations, and each of them worked, imperfectly because war is never clean, but measurably. The casualty rates in later Pacific amphibious operations, for all the fierce fighting and horrific conditions, were lower as a percentage of forces committed than they would have been without the Tarawa lessons. Historians have made a sobering calculation.
The changes implemented as a result of Tarawa may have saved more American lives in subsequent Pacific operations than were lost in the battle itself. The 1,009 men who died on that atoll may have, in a very real and tragic sense, saved thousands of their fellow Marines who came after them. That doesn't make the losses any easier to look at, but it gives them a meaning that extends beyond the 76 hours of the battle itself. There is one more layer to this story that most military histories underemphasize. The American public did not know what happened at Tarawa. Not at first. The U.S. government, which had carefully managed war news since Pearl Harbor, initially released accounts of the battle that emphasized the American victory and minimized the cost. The official communiques used language like fierce resistance and valiant advance, which was accurate but incomplete. What the government did not release were the photographs. Combat photographers and a small U.S. government film crew were on or near the beach during the battle. They captured images that were, by the standards of the time, shocking. Bodies floating in the water, Marines face down on the reef, the tide coming in around the dead. For months after the battle, these images were suppressed. The Roosevelt administration debated whether to release them. Eventually, in February 1944, 3 months after the battle, the government made a decision that was, in retrospect, one of the more psychologically interesting choices of the entire war. They released the photographs. The calculation was this: the American public had been living in a narrative of clean victories. The government was worried that if people didn't understand what the war actually cost, if they weren't emotionally invested in the full reality of it, they would not support the sacrifices that were still to come. The war in the Pacific was going to get harder before it got easier. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and potentially the invasion of the Japanese mainland were ahead. The public needed to be prepared. The photos ran in Life magazine. Americans who opened that magazine in early 1944 saw, for the first time in the war, American dead on an American-held beach. Letters poured into editorial offices, into Congress, into the White House. Some were outraged. Many more were resolved. The effect on enlistment and bond purchases was measurable. There's a lesson in here that goes beyond military doctrine. It's about the relationship between a government and its people in wartime, the question of how much truth is too much, how much is not enough, and who gets to decide. The Tarawa photographs represent one of the few moments in the Second World War where the American government looked at that question and chose, deliberately, to tell the harder truth. It cost them politically in the short term. It may have won them the war in the long term. Let me tell you what happened after the war. The military reforms that grew out of Tarawa didn't stay inside the Navy and Marine Corps. They spread. The doctrine of amphibious assault, the detailed, systematic, intelligence-driven approach to landing forces on a defended coast, became the foundational template for NATO planning throughout the Cold War. The D-Day landings at Normandy in June 1944, which happened 7 months after Tarawa, incorporated lessons from Tarawa in their planning. The specific problems of landing craft versus obstacles, the timing of pre-landing bombardment, the assignment of units to specific beach sectors, the pre-assault hydrographic survey, all of it was informed by what had been learned and bled for on a 3-kilometer island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. There's a direct institutional line between Betio in November 1943 and the beaches of Normandy in June 1944. The doctrine went further still. Today, the Marine Corps' amphibious assault doctrine, which continues to evolve as technology changes, traces its theoretical lineage directly to the lessons of Tarawa. When U.S. Marines conducted amphibious operations in Korea, in Vietnam, during Desert Storm's amphibious feint in the Persian Gulf, and in later operations, they were operating within a framework that was, at its root, built on the insights earned at terrible cost on that reef. The lesson of Tarawa is not just military, it's epistemological. It's about the gap between what planners believe will happen and what actually happens. It's about the cost of optimism unmoored from evidence. It's about the price that is paid, always, in every domain, when the people making decisions choose hope over data. Admiral Shibazaki believed 1 million men couldn't take Tarawa in 100 years. He was wrong. But his defenses were not overestimated. The American planners simply underestimated the cost of defeating them. They assumed their pre-landing power would solve the problem before the problem had to be faced by individual human beings in the water. It didn't. The individual human beings faced it anyway. And then the survivors, the ones who came home, helped build a military that would face the next version of that problem better equipped, better informed, better prepared.
Let me give you the final numbers, because numbers, when they represent human beings, deserve to be said plainly. The Battle of Tarawa lasted 76 hours. In that time, 1,009 American Marines and sailors were killed. 2,101 were wounded. Of the Japanese garrison of approximately 4,500, only 17 surrendered. The rest died. Batio Island, 3.2 kilometers long, never more than 800 meters wide, was the site of some of the highest casualty densities of any battle in American military history. For context, in terms of casualties per square kilometer of contested ground over a 76-hour period, Tarawa was among the deadliest battles in U.S. history. The island was declared secure at 1:30 p.m. on November 23, 1943. Then the Marines buried their dead, repaired the airstrip, and moved on. That airstrip was operational within days. American aircraft were using it to project power toward the Marshall Islands within weeks. The geometry of the Pacific Campaign worked exactly as the planners had designed, but only after the cost had been paid. Batio today is an inhabited island, part of the nation of Kiribati. The rusting hulks of Japanese guns and American landing craft are still visible in the water and on the shore. Bones are occasionally still found in the coral. The Japanese bunkers, the ones that couldn't be bombed out, are still there, many of them structurally intact 80 years later, exactly as sturdy as they appeared to the Marines who had to go in after the men inside them. If you look at the images from that beach in November 1943, what strikes you is not the violence. Violence in photographs becomes abstract after a while. What strikes you is the scale. The vast open water between the reef and the shore with nothing to hide behind. The flat, bare sand. The tiny island that the camera can almost encompass in a single frame. 1 million men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. It took 18,000 Marines, 3 days, and 1,000 lives. And everything that came after, every improved doctrine, every better designed landing craft, every pre-assault survey, every life saved in subsequent operations was purchased there, in that water, on that reef, between the 20th and the 23rd of November, 1943.
Remember that the next time someone tells you that mistakes don't matter, that failures are just speed bumps and we learn and move on with no real cost. Sometimes the cost of a mistake is measured in hundreds of human lives. And sometimes, if the people who survive have the honesty and the courage to look clearly at what happened, that cost buys something that outlasts all of them. The men who died on that reef did not die for nothing. They died teaching a lesson that the living were determined to learn. That's the story of Tarawa. 76 hours, one tiny atoll, and a doctrine that changed the world.